If none of you can solve this theorem, maybe you're not supposed to be in this room. Professor Richard Whitmore's voice sliced cleanly through the lecture hall, sharp enough to make the last few whispers disappear beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. The giant digital clock above the whiteboard flashed 8:07 a.m. in cold red numbers, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the Princeton campus. Nearly 200 students sat frozen in tiered rows of polished wood seats, laptops open, coffee cups steaming, pencils motionless in nervous hands. On the board behind Whitmore stretched nearly 12 feet of equations written in dark black marker, symbols layered over symbols like a foreign language designed to intimidate anyone foolish enough to challenge it. He stood beside the proof with one hand in the pocket of his charcoal blazer, silver hair perfectly combed, wire-rimmed glasses low against the bridge of his nose. The theorem had a reputation. Even graduate students avoided it. Cambridge doctoral candidates struggled with this one. Whitmore continued calmly. So if anyone here believes they've already solved it, a few students laughed quietly. Not loud laughter. The careful kind. The kind students used around powerful professors. In the back row, Naomi Carter slowly raised her hand. It happened so quietly that at first only the girl beside her noticed. Then another student turned. Then another. The movement spread across the room like a ripple through still water until nearly every face in the lecture hall twisted toward the young black girl, sitting near the top corner beneath the flickering light panel. Naomi wore a faded navy hoodie with the sleeves pulled over part of her hands. Her backpack rested beside her chair with one broken zipper hanging open. Dark curls framed her face, slightly damp from the rain outside, and faint shadows sat beneath her eyes like she hadn't slept much in days. She didn't smile when she raised her hand. Didn't look confident either. Just calm. Whitmore stared at her for a moment, almost amused. Then he laughed once under his breath. "Miss Carter," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You've been in my class. Exactly 3 weeks." A few students chuckled harder now. Someone near the center row muttered, "No way." Another student quietly lifted his phone beneath the desk, already recording. Naomi kept her hand raised. Whitmore walked slowly across the front of the lecture hall, expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor. "This theorem defeated half my doctoral class at Cambridge," he repeated. "But please, enlighten us." More laughter. Naomi finally lowered her hand and stood carefully from her seat. The room smelled faintly of wet coats, burnt coffee, and dry erase marker ink. Ethan Blake leaned back in his chair near the front row with a crooked grin. "This should be good," he whispered to the student beside him. Naomi heard him. She heard all of them. But her expression never changed. She stepped into the aisle holding only a mechanical pencil and a worn notebook thick with folded pages. As she descended the stairs toward the front of the lecture hall, Whitmore studied her with the detached curiosity of someone already certain of the outcome. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the campus skyline. Inside, the room had gone strangely still. Naomi stopped beside the whiteboard and looked up at the equations stretching across it. For a brief second, her eyes narrowed. Not from fear, from recognition. Then very quietly, almost too soft for anyone to hear, she said, "Professor, there's a contradiction on line 6. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain pressing against the tall classroom windows. Professor Whitmore did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened almost invisibly as he turned back toward the whiteboard, eyes narrowing behind the reflection of fluorescent light on his glasses. Somewhere near the middle row, a student let out an awkward laugh that died almost the second it escaped. Naomi stood quietly beside the board, one hand holding her worn notebook against her chest while the other rested loosely at her side. She looked small standing beneath 12 feet of equations and symbols, but her voice had not shaken. Whitmore picked up the black marker again and tapped the 6th line once. "A contradiction," he repeated slowly. "That is a very serious claim, Miss Carter." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." The room remained frozen. Ethan Blake leaned forward now, grin fading slightly from his face. Several students lowered their phones, suddenly unsure whether they were witnessing a joke or something else entirely. Whitmore capped the marker with deliberate calm. "Then by all means," he said, stepping aside with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Show us." Naomi approached the board slowly. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor. Up close, the theorem stretched even larger, symbols stacked across multiple sections of the whiteboard in dense black layers. The marker smell hung sharp in the cold classroom air. Naomi studied the sixth line for only a second before reaching for a blue marker resting near the tray. Her fingers were dusted with faint graphite stains from hours spent writing calculations in library notebooks. She circled one variable carefully. Right here, she said softly. The assumption changes between line 5 and 6. Whitmore crossed his arms. It does not. Naomi glanced at him respectfully before looking back at the board. The proof assumes continuity in the first section, she explained quietly, writing beneath the equation in small, precise handwriting. But line 6 introduces a condition that only works under discrete constraints. A few students blinked. Others exchanged confused looks. Ethan frowned and opened his laptop wider. The clicking of keys slowly spread through the lecture hall as students began checking the equations for themselves. Whitmore remained still near the podium. "You are misunderstanding the framework," he said flatly. Naomi shook her head gently. "No, sir. The framework changes here." She underlined the transition point. If the variable remains continuous, the conclusion on line 9 cannot hold. The room seemed to contract around those words. Rainwater slid slowly down the windows in silver streaks while the heating vents hummed softly overhead. Whitmore walked closer to the board now, no longer smiling. He stared directly at the section Naomi had marked. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. Ethan's expression changed completely as his eyes darted between the board and his screen. "Wait," he muttered under his breath. "She is right." The student beside him looked over quickly. "No way." Ethan pointed at the equation. "Look at the transition variable. It breaks the condition. More typing. More silence." Naomi stepped back from the board and lowered the marker. She did not look triumphant, did not smirk or challenge anyone. She simply stood there quietly while the classroom atmosphere shifted around her like pressure building before a storm. Whitmore removed his glasses slowly and rubbed one hand across his mouth. The confidence that had filled the room earlier now felt strangely fragile. Naomi looked toward the board one last time before speaking again, her voice calm enough to almost disappear beneath the rain. "The theorem itself is not wrong," she said softly. "But the proof on line 6 cannot support the conclusion." Nobody laughed this time. Professor Whitmore stared at the board so long that the entire lecture hall began holding its breath with him. The blue circle Naomi had drawn around the variable looked painfully small compared to the massive theorem surrounding it. Yet somehow it had become the only thing anyone in the room could see. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking the gray Princeton courtyard while the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere near the back row, a coffee cup tipped slightly against a desk, the lid rattling in nervous fingers. Nobody moved to help. Nobody wanted to break the silence. Whitmore stepped closer to the board until he stood barely a foot away from Naomi's correction. His reflection blurred faintly in the glossy white surface beneath the equations. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that this proof contains a structural inconsistency." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." He inhaled slowly through his nose. "This proof has been peer-reviewed." "I know. It has been taught at Cambridge, Stanford, and MIT." "Yes, sir." Whitmore turned toward her fully now. "Then perhaps you should explain why none of those institutions noticed what you claim to have found." The words landed coldly, but Naomi did not shrink beneath them. She looked tired more than intimidated, like someone who had spent too many nights carrying responsibilities heavier than her age. "Because most people stopped checking after line 5, she answered quietly. A few students exchanged stunned looks. Ethan Blake stopped typing altogether. The heating system kicked on with a low metallic hum, blowing warm air through the vents, but the room still felt cold. Whitmore removed the cap from the black marker again and began writing rapidly beneath Naomi's correction. Symbols spread across the lower half of the board in aggressive strokes, while the marker squealed against the glossy surface. He rewrote the transition condition, reframed the assumption, rebuilt the conclusion step by step. Naomi watched silently beside him, arms folded lightly around her notebook. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The classroom remained absolutely still except for the sound of marker against board and occasional keyboard clicks as students followed the equations in real time. Finally, Whitmore stopped writing. The marker lowered slowly in his hand. A thin line of black ink stained the side of his finger. Ethan looked down at his laptop screen and swallowed hard. "Oh my God," he whispered. The student beside him blinked repeatedly at the equations. "It breaks," she murmured. "The entire thing breaks." Whitmore's shoulders stiffened. The revised proof collapsed at the exact same point Naomi had identified. The contradiction remained. Small, precise, unavoidable. Naomi spoke softly into the silence. The theorem itself can still work if the continuity assumption is replaced before the transition. Whitmore did not answer. She stepped forward carefully and reached for the blue marker again. "May I?" For a second, he looked like he might refuse. Then, almost mechanically, he stepped aside. Naomi began writing beneath the broken section of the proof. Her handwriting remained small and clean, every symbol carefully spaced. She did not rush, did not show off. She simply rebuilt the theorem from the fracture point forward with quiet concentration while nearly 200 students watched in complete silence. The earlier amusement in the room had vanished so completely it felt unreal now. Even the students who had laughed loudest sat frozen behind glowing laptop screens. Naomi finished the final line after several long minutes and set the marker down gently in the tray. Then she stepped back. Ethan stared at the board with parted lips. The revised proof was shorter than Whitmore's original version by nearly half. Cleaner too. Elegant in a way that made the earlier equations suddenly look heavy and overcomplicated. Whitmore looked at the theorem, then at Naomi, then back at the theorem again. His face had lost all color. Outside, the rain finally began to slow, pale morning light pressing weakly through the clouds. Inside the lecture hall, nobody seemed willing to speak first. The first sound came from the very back row. One slow clap, then another. Not loud, almost hesitant. Ethan Blake lowered his hands immediately afterward, as if even he was surprised he had started it. Nobody joined him. The lecture hall remained suspended in that strange silence where people knew something important had just happened, but had not yet figured out how to react to it. Naomi stood beside the board with blue marker dust faintly staining her fingertips, while Professor Whitmore stared at the corrected theorem like it belonged to someone else entirely. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, briefly dimming the room before humming back to life. Outside, the rain had softened into a cold mist drifting across the stone walkways of campus. Whitmore finally cleared his throat. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. No one moved. The words lacked the authority they usually carried. Students remained frozen behind glowing laptop screens and half-empty coffee cups, eyes bouncing between Naomi and the board. Whitmore turned toward the podium and gathered his notes with careful precision, but his hands no longer looked steady. One loose sheet slipped from the stack and drifted to the floor. He bent quickly to retrieve it before anyone else could. Naomi lowered her notebook against her side and stepped away from the whiteboard. The closer she came to the aisles, the more the students seemed to part for her without realizing they were doing it. The same people who had laughed 15 minutes earlier now avoided meeting her eyes altogether. Ethan stood as she passed his row. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Naomi stopped. Up close, he suddenly looked much younger than he had from the front of the lecture hall. Less confident, too. He glanced back at the board. That was insane. Naomi shifted her notebook slightly beneath her arm. "I was not trying to embarrass him." Ethan let out a short breath. "You did not." His eyes flicked toward Whitmore near the podium. "The math did." Naomi said nothing to that. She simply nodded politely and continued toward the exit while conversation slowly began erupting behind her in low, anxious murmurs. "Did you see line 6? How did nobody catch that? She rewrote the entire proof. Who even is she?" Naomi pushed open the heavy lecture hall doors and stepped into the long stone corridor outside. The hallway smelled faintly of old books, floor polish, and rain carried in from students' coats. Her shoulders loosened slightly the moment the classroom disappeared behind her, but exhaustion quickly settled into its place. She had worked until nearly 2 in the morning shelving books in Firestone Library before returning to her apartment off Nassau Street to finish reviewing Whitmore's lecture notes. Her mother had already been asleep on the couch when she got home, oxygen machine humming softly beside the television glow. Naomi had studied until sunrise anyway. Not because she wanted attention, because something about line 6 had bothered her too much to ignore. She adjusted the strap of her worn backpack and headed toward the staircase when a voice echoed behind her. "Miss Carter." She stopped immediately. Whitmore stood at the end of the corridor, holding a leather folder tightly beneath one arm. Without the classroom lights reflecting off him, he suddenly looked older than before. More tired somehow. Students walking past slowed subtly, pretending not to stare. Whitmore approached her carefully, polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Naomi waited quietly. Finally, he looked at her notebook. "Where did you learn to analyze proofs like that?" Naomi hesitated. "Mostly from library archives, sir." His brow tightened slightly. "You studied graduate material before coming here?" "Some of it." "With whom?" Naomi shifted her weight softly. "Mostly alone." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment after that. Not dismissively this time. Not mockingly either. More like he was trying to recalculate something he thought he already understood. Behind them, students continued whispering in clusters beneath the cold hallway lights, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking campus. Whitmore glanced once toward the lecture hall doors, then back at Naomi. "My office," he said quietly. 4 o'clock. Naomi blinked once, surprised. "Yes, sir." He nodded stiffly and walked away without another word, leather folder pressed tightly against his side, while the hallway slowly swallowed the sound of his footsteps. By 3:30 that afternoon, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the Princeton campus wrapped in the pale silver light that always came after a storm. Naomi Carter sat alone at a corner desk on the 3rd floor of Firestone Library with a stack of photocopied journals spread around her like fragile puzzle pieces. The old radiator beside the window hissed softly every few minutes, warming the air just enough to fight the chill trapped inside the stone building. Students moved quietly between shelves carrying backpacks and coffee cups, but Naomi barely noticed them. Her pencil moved steadily across a yellow legal pad already crowded with equations, arrows, and handwritten notes squeezed into every empty margin. She had been trying not to think about 4 o'clock, trying not to replay the lecture hall in her mind. The laughter, the silence afterward, the look on Professor Whitmore's face when the theorem collapsed beneath its own contradiction. Naomi rubbed her tired eyes and glanced toward the library clock. 3:47. Her stomach tightened slightly. She closed the journals carefully and slid them back into neat stacks. Most of the pages had library stamps older than she was. Some smelled faintly of dust and yellowed paper. One of the books still carried handwritten notes from a graduate student in 1986. Naomi loved that part of the library most, the feeling that minds from decades ago still whispered quietly through the margins if someone bothered to listen closely enough. She packed her notebook slowly into her worn backpack, making sure not to bend the loose pages filled with calculations. Her phone buzzed softly across the table. "Mom, do not forget to eat tonight." Naomi smiled faintly despite herself. She typed back quickly. "I will. Love you." Another message appeared almost immediately. "Proud of you." Naomi stared at those 3 words for a second longer than necessary before slipping the phone back into her pocket. She stood and headed downstairs through rows of dim shelves and pools of warm reading light. The smell of old paper followed her all the way into the marble corridor outside. By the time she crossed the courtyard toward the mathematics building, the sky had begun turning pale gold behind the Gothic rooftops. Damp leaves scraped softly across the stone pathways in the wind. Students laughed somewhere in the distance near Nassau Street, but the closer Naomi came to the mathematics department, the quieter the campus seemed to become. Professor Whitmore's office sat on the 4th floor behind a heavy oak door with a brass nameplate polished bright enough to reflect the hallway lights. Naomi paused outside for a moment, adjusting the strap on her backpack. Through the door, she could hear faint movement. Papers shifting, a drawer closing, then Whitmore's voice. "Come in." The office smelled faintly of coffee, leather bindings, and dry erase ink. Tall bookshelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, crowded with mathematics journals, framed awards, and old conference photos. Large windows overlooked the darkening campus below, where students crossed the courtyard beneath glowing lampposts. Whitmore stood near his desk without his blazer now, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. The exhaustion on his face looked deeper in the softer evening light. Naomi stepped inside quietly. You wanted to see me, sir? Whitmore nodded once and motioned toward the chair across from his desk. Naomi sat carefully, backpack resting against her feet. For several long seconds, Whitmore said nothing at all. He simply studied the notebook in his hands. Naomi recognized it instantly. It was hers. The cheap black spiral notebook she had accidentally left on the lecture hall desk after class. Whitmore finally looked up. I read this. Naomi's chest tightened slightly. Whitmore opened the notebook slowly. Pages filled with dense calculations, rewritten proofs, and margin notes spread beneath the warm desk lamplight. Some pages were smudged with pencil graphite. Others carried faint brown coffee stains. You corrected 3 of my published lectures in here, he said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. I was only checking the logic. Whitmore let out a slow breath through his nose. Do you have any idea how unusual this is? Naomi looked back up at him calmly. No, sir. He studied her again, but this time there was no trace of mockery left in his expression. Only something quieter, something far more unsettled. Professor Whitmore closed the notebook slowly, fingertips resting against the worn black cover as though it carried far more weight than paper should. The office had grown darker while they spoke. Outside the tall windows, the last traces of daylight faded behind Princeton's stone rooftops, leaving only scattered amber lights glowing across campus walkways below. Naomi sat quietly in the chair across from him, hands folded loosely in her lap, trying not to stare at the stack of marked lecture notes spread across his desk. Red ink covered several pages. Corrections. Revisions. Entire sections crossed out. Whitmore leaned back in his chair with a long exhale. You solved a contradiction that survived peer review, he said finally. Do you understand what that means? Naomi hesitated. It means somebody missed it. A faint smile almost touched the corner of Whitmore's mouth before disappearing again. Yes, he said softly. Somebody did. The radiator near the bookshelf hissed quietly, filling the silence between them. Naomi noticed framed photographs, lining the shelf behind his desk now that the room had dimmed. Conferences in Zurich. Lectures at Cambridge. Awards dinners filled with men in dark suits shaking hands beneath chandeliers. In every photo, Whitmore looked confident, untouchable. The man sitting across from her now looked different somehow, smaller around the eyes, tired in places pride used to cover. He stood slowly and walked toward the window overlooking campus. Students crossed the courtyard 4 stories below, bundled in coats against the cold evening air. When I was 27, Whitmore said without turning around, I published my first theorem revision. Naomi listened quietly. I thought brilliance meant never being wrong. His reflection shifted faintly against the dark window glass. Academia rewards certainty, confidence, authority. He glanced back at her. People stop questioning you once your name becomes large enough. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the notebook on his desk. That sounds dangerous. Whitmore let out a quiet breath through his nose that almost sounded like a laugh. It is. Silence settled again. The office smelled faintly of old paper and cooling coffee. Naomi noticed a ceramic mug near the edge of the desk with cold coffee, still untouched inside. Whitmore returned to his chair slowly and opened her notebook one more time. These calculations, he said, flipping carefully through the pages. How long did this take you? Naomi thought for a moment. A few months. Whitmore looked up sharply. Months. She nodded. I work nights at the library. I study between shifts. Whitmore stared at her. And you did all this alone? Naomi shrugged lightly. Mostly. He leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting against the desk. Miss Carter, these are graduate-level corrections. Some of them exceed graduate-level work. Naomi looked uncomfortable hearing that. Her fingers tightened briefly around the sleeve of her hoodie. Whitmore noticed. Why mathematics? He asked more quietly this time. Naomi looked toward the dark windows before answering. Because numbers do not care who you are. Whitmore remained still. Naomi's voice stayed calm, but softer now. People do. Professors do. Admissions offices do. Employers do. She looked down at the graphite stains faintly marking her fingertips. But equations either work or they do not. The words seemed to land somewhere deep inside the room. Whitmore removed his glasses slowly and rubbed one hand across his face. For the first time all day, he looked genuinely ashamed. Naomi noticed it immediately. I was not trying to disrespect you this morning, she said gently. Whitmore lowered his hand. No, he answered after a long pause. You were trying to protect the integrity of the proof. Naomi nodded once. Whitmore stared at the notebook again, then finally spoke the words that seemed hardest for him to say. And I laughed at you before you even reached the board. The office fell completely silent after that. No defensiveness. No excuses. Just the truth sitting openly between them beneath the warm desk lamp glow. Naomi looked at him carefully for a moment before answering in the same calm voice she had used all day. You were not the first person who assumed I did not belong in the room. Whitmore's expression tightened almost painfully. Outside the window, the campus lights shimmered against damp stone paths, while somewhere below a clock tower began slowly striking 5. The clock tower's final chime faded slowly into the evening air, while Professor Whitmore remained motionless behind his desk. Naomi's words still lingered in the office like something too honest to ignore. You were not the first person who assumed I did not belong in the room. Whitmore lowered his eyes toward the open notebook between them, but he was no longer looking at equations. Naomi could see it in the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his fingers rested against the edge of the paper without turning the page. The office suddenly felt smaller than before, quieter too. Outside the tall windows, students crossed the courtyard beneath glowing lamps, their shadows stretching long across the wet stone paths. Whitmore finally spoke, his voice lower than usual. How many times? Naomi blinked softly. Sir. He looked up at her now. How many times has that happened? Naomi sat back slightly in the chair, surprised by the question more than the tone behind it. She thought about pretending she did not understand. Thought about giving a polite answer that would let both of them move on comfortably. But something about the exhaustion in Whitmore's face made honesty feel safer than usual. Enough that I stopped being surprised by it, she answered quietly. Whitmore looked away first. The radiator hissed softly near the bookshelf while a draft rattled faintly against the old window glass. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her hoodie over her hand before continuing. At my last school, one professor thought I copied my exam because I finished early. Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. What happened? He made me retake it alone in his office. And Naomi gave a faint shrug. I scored higher the second time. Whitmore exhaled slowly through his nose. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the conference photographs on the wall behind him. Rooms full of scholars. White tablecloths. Men in dark suits smiling confidently beneath gold chandeliers. She wondered suddenly how many people in those pictures had looked at her and already decided what she could not possibly know. Whitmore followed her gaze toward the wall. You think those rooms would not welcome you, he said quietly. Naomi hesitated. I think some people hear my voice before they hear my work. The words landed heavily between them. Whitmore removed his glasses again, rubbing the bridge of his nose with visible weariness. Academia likes to believe it is objective, he murmured. But institutions are still made of people. Naomi nodded once. Equations are objective. People are not. A silence followed that felt different from the others. Less tense. More honest somehow. Whitmore closed the notebook carefully and slid it across the desk toward her. You should not be teaching yourself out of photocopied archives at 2 in the morning. Naomi rested her hand lightly on the notebook cover. Sometimes that is all I have access to. Whitmore stared at her for several seconds before opening a desk drawer beside him. He pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded university tag. Graduate Research Library, he said, placing it gently on the desk between them. Naomi looked down at it without touching it. Only doctoral candidates and faculty have access after hours. Sir, I cannot take that. Yes, you can. His voice carried no arrogance this time. Only certainty. The material in that library is where you belong. Naomi looked at the key again, warm desk lamp light glinting softly against the brass edges. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She had spent years teaching herself from discarded textbooks, outdated journals, and scanned pages because she could not afford the resources students around her treated like background noise. Whitmore seemed to understand that now without needing it explained. He leaned back slowly in his chair. There is another reason I asked you here. Naomi looked up carefully. Whitmore folded his hands together, choosing his words with visible caution. The theorem you corrected this morning, he paused briefly. I was scheduled to present that proof next week at the International Mathematics Conference in Boston. Naomi's expression shifted slightly. Whitmore let out a humorless breath. If you had not spoken up today, I would have stood in front of 600 scholars presenting a contradiction that could have dismantled my entire paper. The room fell silent once more. Naomi looked down at the brass key resting on the desk between them while Whitmore stared toward the dark campus outside his window, the weight of what almost happened settling slowly across both of them. Naomi did not touch the brass key right away. It remained on the edge of Professor Whitmore's desk beneath the warm yellow glow of the lamp, small and ordinary looking despite how much it represented. Outside the office windows, the Princeton campus had gone almost completely dark except for the scattered pools of light beneath iron lampposts and the distant glow from dormitory windows. Students drifted across the courtyards below like blurred shadows moving through cold autumn air. Whitmore sat quietly behind the desk, hands folded together now, watching Naomi with an expression that no longer carried superiority or skepticism, only reflection. Naomi finally lifted the key, carefully between her fingers. The metal felt heavier than expected. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked softly. Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. "Because brilliance should not need permission to access knowledge." Naomi looked down at the faded university tag attached to the ring. Graduate Research Archive. Access Level 4. Her throat tightened again before she forced herself to steady it. Most professors do not say things like that. Whitmore gave a faint, tired smile. Most professors are still trying to protect their pride. Silence settled softly through the office. Naomi slid the key carefully into the front pocket of her backpack as though afraid it might disappear if handled too roughly. Whitmore watched her for a moment before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." Naomi looked up. Whitmore stood and walked toward a shelf near the back wall lined with conference binders and framed certificates. He removed a dark blue folder stamped with the silver emblem of the International Mathematics Conference and placed it on the desk between them. Naomi recognized the title immediately. The Theorem from Class. Revised Structural Continuity Frameworks in Advanced Systems Analysis. Whitmore rested one hand against the folder. "This paper is the centerpiece of next week's conference." Naomi's eyes shifted toward him carefully. "You said 600 scholars would be there. Closer to 800 this year." Naomi swallowed slightly. Whitmore opened the folder slowly. Printed pages covered in annotations and handwritten revisions filled the binder. Some sections had already been crossed out in red ink since that morning. "Do you know what would have happened if the contradiction survived the presentation?" Naomi shook her head. Whitmore stared down at the paper for a moment before answering. "The academic community would have dismantled it publicly within hours." His voice remained calm, but Naomi could hear the humiliation hidden beneath the control. "My reputation would have survived eventually. Perhaps. But the damage." He stopped himself there. Naomi looked toward the windows. "That is why you looked afraid today." Whitmore blinked once, surprised by the word. "Afraid." He did not deny it. "I have spent 30 years building authority," he admitted quietly. "You identified a flaw in under 10 minutes." Naomi shifted uncomfortably in the chair. "I was not trying to prove something." Whitmore looked at her carefully. "That may be the most unusual part." The office clock ticked softly against the wall while cold wind rattled faintly outside the old window frames. Whitmore opened Naomi's notebook again and flipped slowly through pages filled with calculations. "You think differently than most mathematicians," he said. "You do not chase complexity for prestige." Naomi looked at the notebook. "Complexity is not always intelligence." Whitmore gave another faint smile, smaller this time. "No. Sometimes it is insecurity wearing expensive language." Naomi almost smiled at that, but stopped herself. For a brief second, the tension in the room eased into something quieter, almost human. Then Whitmore turned one page farther into the notebook, and his expression changed. Naomi noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly behind his glasses as he stared at a set of equations near the bottom corner of the page. "What is this?" he asked softly. Naomi leaned forward and immediately recognized the section. Her stomach tightened. "That was just an idea." Whitmore kept reading. "This is not just an idea." He looked back up at her slowly. "Miss Carter, this is an original expansion model." Naomi lowered her eyes. "It probably does not work." Whitmore stood very still beside the desk lamp glow, studying the page again with growing disbelief. "No," he murmured quietly. "I think it does." The room seemed to hold its breath once more while outside the campus lights shimmered across rain-dark stone, and for the second time that day, Professor Richard Whitmore realized he was looking at something far rarer than talent. Professor Whitmore did not sit back down for a long time. He remained standing beside the desk with Naomi's notebook open beneath the warm circle of lamplight, eyes fixed on the equations covering the page like he was afraid they might disappear if he looked away too quickly. Naomi watched him, quietly from across the office, exhaustion pressing into her shoulders now that the adrenaline from earlier had finally begun fading. Outside the tall windows, the campus had settled into nighttime silence. The wet stone paths below reflected pale gold from the lampposts, and somewhere in the distance a siren echoed faintly across town before fading into the cold air. Whitmore turned another page slowly, then another. Every few seconds his brow tightened deeper. Naomi knew what he was seeing. Variations of the same model. Half-finished calculations. Notes scribbled in the margins during overnight library shifts while students around her slept. Most of the pages were messy because she never expected anyone else to read them. "You developed this alone?" Whitmore asked without looking up. Naomi nodded once. "Mostly on breaks at work." Whitmore glanced at her sharply. "Breaks?" Naomi gave a small shrug. "When the library gets quiet around midnight, I study between shelving carts." Whitmore stared at her for several seconds before lowering his eyes back to the notebook. The office suddenly felt too quiet again. He flipped farther into the pages until he reached a section filled with crossed-out equations and heavy graphite smudges. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 19. Whitmore closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Just for a second. When he opened them again, something inside his expression had shifted completely. Not simply respect. Something closer to regret. "At 19, he murmured, almost to himself, "I still thought intelligence belonged only to people who sounded like me." Naomi looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Whitmore exhaled slowly and finally sat back in his chair. "Do you know why your correction frightened me this morning?" Naomi hesitated. "Because the theorem was wrong?" Whitmore shook his head faintly. "No. Mathematics survives being wrong. That is the entire point of mathematics." He looked directly at her now. "What frightened me was how quickly I dismissed you before you even spoke." Naomi remained silent. Whitmore rubbed one hand against his jaw, visibly tired. "I have spent decades lecturing students about intellectual honesty." His voice lowered further. "And this morning I failed my own standard in front of an entire classroom." The radiator hissed softly again, while papers shifted faintly beneath the draft near the windows. Naomi studied him carefully. Most professors she had encountered would have defended themselves by now. Explained, rationalized, protected their pride. Whitmore looked too exhausted for any of that. "People do not usually admit things like this," Naomi said gently. Whitmore let out a humorless breath. "That may be part of the problem." Silence settled again. Naomi glanced toward the dark conference folder still resting near the edge of the desk. "What happens now?" Whitmore followed her gaze. "Now I rewrite 40% of my presentation before Boston." Naomi blinked slightly. "In 1 week." Whitmore gave the faintest trace of a smile. "You are not the only person who works through the night." Naomi almost smiled back before catching herself. Whitmore noticed anyway. He opened the notebook again and carefully removed a loose sheet folded near the back pages. Naomi immediately recognized it and felt her stomach tighten. It was the expansion model she never intended anyone to see. Whitmore held the page carefully by the edges. "This framework," he said slowly, "if your assumptions are correct, it could restructure adaptive continuity theory entirely." Naomi shook her head quickly. "It is incomplete." So was Einstein's first draft. Naomi looked down immediately, uncomfortable with the comparison. Whitmore leaned forward slightly now, seriousness returning to his voice. "Miss Carter, has anyone here mentored you?" Naomi hesitated too long before answering. Whitmore understood anyway. "No," she admitted softly. He nodded once, almost sadly. Outside the office windows, cold wind swept fallen leaves across the dark courtyard below, while the mathematics building settled deeper into nighttime silence. Whitmore looked at the equations in Naomi's notebook one more time before speaking again, quieter than before. "That may be the university's greatest failure of all." The mathematics building was nearly empty by the time Naomi finally stepped out of Professor Whitmore's office. The hallway lights had dimmed automatically for the night, casting long pale reflections across the marble floors while the old building settled into silence around her. She tightened her coat against the cold draft drifting through the stairwell windows and started down the corridor with her backpack hanging heavily from one shoulder. Inside the front pocket rested the brass research key Whitmore had given her. Every few steps, she could feel it lightly tapping against her notebook through the fabric like a quiet reminder that the day had actually happened. Outside, the night air carried the sharp, clean smell of rain-soaked stone and fallen leaves. Naomi crossed the empty courtyard beneath rows of glowing lampposts, while wind brushed softly through the dark trees overhead. Most dorm windows still glowed with warm yellow light, students laughing somewhere in the distance, music echoing faintly from Nassau Street. Naomi walked past it all quietly, exhausted down to her bones. By the time she reached her apartment building off Mercer Street, it was nearly 8:30. The hallway smelled faintly of old radiator heat and laundry detergent. Naomi unlocked the apartment door carefully so she would not wake her mother if she had finally fallen asleep. But the television glow was still flickering softly across the living room. Her mother, Denise Carter, sat wrapped in a blanket on the couch with an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose and a half-finished cup of tea cooling on the coffee table beside her. "You are late," Denise said gently without looking away from the television. Naomi smiled faintly and set her backpack down near the door. "Long day." Denise muted the television and studied her daughter carefully. Mothers noticed exhaustion differently than everyone else. Naomi could never hide it from her. Something happened. Naomi hesitated for a second before walking into the kitchen corner and opening the refrigerator. The cold light spilled softly across the apartment's worn linoleum floor. "Professor Whitmore asked me to his office." Denise raised her eyebrows immediately. "The famous one?" Naomi nodded while pulling out leftover soup. "That sounds serious." Naomi leaned against the counter quietly for a moment before answering. "I corrected one of his proofs in class today." Denise blinked once. "You what?" Naomi let out the smallest tired laugh. "It was wrong." Denise stared at her daughter for 2 full seconds before slowly smiling to herself. "Well," she said calmly, "I imagine he did not enjoy that very much." Naomi heated the soup in the microwave while the soft mechanical hum filled the apartment. "At first he laughed at me." Denise's smile faded instantly. Naomi shrugged lightly before her mother could react. Then he checked the theorem. The microwave light glowed softly against Naomi's tired face, while rainwater still clung faintly to the edges of her curls. Denise watched her carefully. "And?" Naomi looked down at the slowly turning bowl of soup. "I was right." Silence settled gently across the apartment. Not shocked silence. Proud silence. Denise leaned back against the couch cushions with tired eyes glistening faintly in the television glow. "Baby," she said softly, "you have been right your whole life. Some people are just slower at noticing." Naomi looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the soup before the emotion in her chest could rise too visibly. The microwave beeped softly. She carried the bowl toward the couch and sat beside her mother while cold wind rattled faintly against the apartment windows. Denise noticed the brass key hanging partly from Naomi's backpack pocket almost immediately. "What is that?" Naomi touched the key lightly with her fingertips. "Graduate research access." Denise blinked in surprise. "He gave you that?" Naomi nodded once. Denise stared at her daughter quietly for several seconds before speaking again. "Your grandfather used to say something when people underestimated him." Naomi looked over. Denise smiled softly beneath the warm lamplight. "A closed door only stays closed until the right mind walks up to it." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the brass key resting against her hand. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to believe the door might finally be opening. The graduate research library smelled different from the rest of campus. Richer somehow. Older. Like paper, leather, dust, and decades of sleepless minds pressed quietly into the walls. Naomi stood just inside the heavy oak doors a little after midnight with the brass key still warm from her hand. The room stretched wider than she expected beneath dim amber reading lamps and vaulted ceilings crossed with dark wooden beams. Tall shelves climbed nearly 30 feet high, packed tightly with journals and mathematical archives most undergraduate students never even knew existed. Somewhere deep inside the building, an old ventilation system hummed softly through the silence. Naomi stepped carefully across the polished floor as though afraid the room might decide she did not belong there after all. She had walked past this door for weeks without realizing what sat behind it. Now the lock had opened with a single quiet click. Her backpack rested heavily against one shoulder, still carrying library notes, a half-empty water bottle, and the sandwich she forgot to eat earlier that evening. She moved slowly between the shelves until she reached the advanced systems section Whitmore had mentioned. The titles alone made her chest tighten slightly. Research papers she had only seen referenced online. Archived dissertations from Zurich and Oxford. Entire collections she used to photocopy one page at a time because public access was restricted. Naomi reached out carefully and pulled one journal free from the shelf. Adaptive Continuity Models. First edition. She opened it slowly beneath the warm reading light. Notes filled the margins in faded pencil handwriting from scholars long gone. Tiny corrections. Questions. Frustrations. Proofs rewritten by people who spent their lives chasing patterns invisible to everyone else. Naomi smiled faintly to herself for the first time all day. I thought I might find you here. The voice startled her softly, but not enough to make her jump. She turned and saw Ethan Blake standing near the end of the aisle holding two paper coffee cups. His dark wool coat still carried cold night air inside its folds. Naomi blinked in surprise. What are you doing here? Ethan lifted one coffee cup slightly. I could ask you. The same thing. Naomi glanced around the library shelves awkwardly. I did not know students could come in here. Ethan smiled faintly. Most students cannot. He noticed the brass key hanging from Naomi's backpack zipper, and his expression shifted immediately. Whitmore gave you access. Naomi nodded once. Ethan let out a low whistle beneath his breath. That explains a lot. Naomi accepted the coffee carefully when he offered it. The warmth soaked instantly into her cold fingers. What explains a lot? Ethan leaned lightly against the shelf beside her. He canceled tomorrow's faculty dinner. Naomi frowned slightly. Why? Ethan laughed quietly. Because he has apparently locked himself in his office rewriting an entire conference presentation. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup. Guilt brushed softly through her chest again, but Ethan noticed immediately. Hey, he said gently. You did not embarrass him. Naomi stared at the steam rising from the lid. It still happened. Ethan shook his head. No. What happened was the truth showed up in a classroom. His voice softened slightly. Most professors would rather protect their ego than admit they missed something. Naomi looked toward the shelves filled with journals and research archives glowing beneath warm lamplight. He admitted it. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah. A quiet silence settled between them. Somewhere deeper in the library, pages turned softly. Naomi took a careful sip of coffee, finally realizing how tired she really was. Ethan studied the open journal in her hands. You know everybody is talking about you now. Naomi sighed softly into the cup. That sounds terrible. Ethan laughed under his breath. Honestly, half the department is terrified. The other half is pretending they noticed the contradiction too. Naomi shook her head faintly. People like pretending they knew things earlier than they did. Ethan smiled at that. Then his expression shifted more serious. Whitmore has never invited a freshman into this library before. Naomi looked down at the brass key again. Ethan followed her gaze. You changed something today, he said quietly. Naomi stood silently beneath the amber, reading lights while the old library breathed softly around them. For years, she had studied mathematics alone in corners where nobody looked twice at her. Now for the first time, the doors around her were opening one by one. And somewhere upstairs, a professor who once laughed before hearing her speak was staying awake through the night rewriting his life's work because a 19-year-old black girl refused to stay silent when the math was wrong. Boston smelled like cold harbor air and fresh coffee the morning of the International Mathematics Conference. Naomi stood near the enormous glass windows of the convention center lobby with her coat folded neatly across one arm, while hundreds of scholars, researchers, and university officials moved through the building around her in waves of dark suits and conference badges. Soft conversations echoed beneath the high ceilings, blending with rolling suitcase wheels and the distant hiss of espresso machines from the cafe downstairs. Most people passed Naomi without looking twice. A 19-year-old black college freshman did not fit naturally into rooms like this, at least not according to the assumptions many people carried silently behind their polished smiles. Naomi noticed the glances anyway. The subtle hesitation when she stepped near faculty registration. The quick confusion when someone saw the gold guest badge hanging around her neck beneath the words Princeton Mathematics Department. She had learned years ago how to recognize disbelief before people even spoke it aloud. "You made it." Naomi turned as Ethan Blake approached through the crowded lobby carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and wearing a Navy conference badge clipped neatly to his jacket. "Barely," Naomi admitted softly. The train from Princeton had been delayed nearly an hour because of weather. She had studied the entire ride anyway. Ethan handed her 1 coffee and glanced around the convention center with a faint grin. "Welcome to the annual gathering of people who believe sleep is optional." Naomi almost smiled. Around them, giant digital screens displayed conference schedules and keynote speakers, while groups of professors clustered beneath banners, discussing research theories with the intensity of courtroom arguments. Naomi recognized names she had only ever read in journals. Some of the most respected mathematicians in the world were standing less than 50 feet away debating equations over coffee and pastries. The scale of it all pressed quietly against her chest. Ethan noticed immediately. "You okay?" Naomi looked toward the massive presentation hall doors across the lobby. "I do not think anyone here expects me to belong." Ethan followed her gaze. "A week ago, half our department thought that too." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. Ethan's voice softened. "They were wrong." Before Naomi could answer, the convention center speakers crackled overhead announcing the start of the keynote presentations. Crowds began drifting toward the main auditorium beneath soft golden lights. Ethan nodded toward the doors. "Whitmore presents in 20 minutes. Naomi's stomach tightened slightly. She had not seen him since the night in his office. Only brief emails about revisions to the theorem and a single message sent at 2:13 in the morning 3 nights earlier. "Your expansion model works." Naomi still had not fully processed those 4 words. They entered the auditorium together beneath rows of dimmed chandeliers hanging high above the stage. Nearly 800 seats curved through the massive hall, already filling with scholars flipping through printed research summaries and adjusting translation headsets. Naomi sat near the back automatically, instinct more than choice. Years of being overlooked had trained her to occupy corners quietly. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. Down on stage, technicians adjusted microphones while giant projection screens displayed Whitmore's conference title in crisp white letters against a dark blue background. Revised Structural Continuity Frameworks in Advanced Systems Analysis. Naomi stared at the title silently. Just days ago, the theorem beneath that presentation had been broken. Whitmore had rebuilt nearly half of it from scratch in under a week. Because she refused to stay quiet in class. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly. Conversations softened into murmurs. Then, finally, Professor Richard Whitmore stepped onto the stage beneath the bright conference lights wearing a dark charcoal suit and silver tie. The room welcomed him immediately with polite applause. Naomi watched carefully from the back row while Whitmore adjusted his glasses at the podium and looked out across hundreds of waiting faces. For a brief second, his eyes swept through the auditorium until they found her near the rear aisle beneath the dim amber lights. He paused, only for a moment, but Naomi noticed. Then Whitmore looked down at the prepared speech resting in his hands. And slowly, in front of 800 scholars, he closed it. The auditorium remained perfectly still after Professor Whitmore closed his prepared speech. 800 scholars sat beneath the soft chandelier light watching him in silence, while the giant projection screens behind the stage glowed with equations and conference titles that suddenly seemed less important than whatever was happening at the podium. Whitmore rested both hands lightly against the edges of the lectern. For the first time since Naomi had seen him, he looked nervous, not intellectually challenged. Human. He adjusted his glasses once, eyes moving slowly across the audience before speaking. "A week ago," he began quietly, "I entered a lecture hall believing experience guaranteed authority." His voice echoed gently through the massive room. No one moved. "I believed reputation protected me from oversight." Naomi sat frozen near the back row beneath the dim amber aisle lights, fingers wrapped tightly around the conference notebook resting in her lap. Whitmore continued carefully. "Then a student challenged a theorem I was preparing to present today." A subtle ripple moved through the audience. Several scholars exchanged curious looks, while others leaned forward slightly in their seats. Whitmore glanced down briefly at the closed speech still resting beneath his hand. At first, he admitted, I dismissed her before I even listened. Naomi lowered her eyes instantly. The room had become so quiet, she could hear the faint electrical hum from the overhead lights. Whitmore turned slightly toward the enormous projection screen behind him. The corrected theorem appeared there now, clean and elegant beneath crisp white text. The contradiction in my original framework would have survived all the way to this conference if she had chosen silence instead of integrity. The words landed heavily across the auditorium. Naomi felt Ethan glance toward her beside the aisle, but she could not look up. Whitmore stepped away from the podium slowly now, no longer hiding behind prepared notes or academic language. There is a dangerous habit in institutions like ours, he said calmly. We become so accustomed to certain voices carrying authority that we stop listening carefully to voices we do not expect brilliance from. Several faces in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Whitmore did not soften the truth. That failure belongs to me. Naomi finally looked up again. Whitmore's eyes found her instantly across the crowded hall. The corrected model you are about to see, he said clearly, was only possible because a 19-year-old student refused to let my reputation outweigh the mathematics. A low murmur spread softly through the auditorium now. Whitmore turned fully toward the audience again. Miss Naomi Carter, he said, his voice steady beneath the conference lights. Would you please stand? Naomi's breath caught instantly. Hundreds of heads turned toward the back rows almost at once. For one terrifying second, she considered remaining seated. Remaining invisible. It would have been easier. Safer. But Ethan gave her the smallest nod beside her. Naomi slowly rose to her feet beneath the warm aisle lights. Conference notebook still pressed tightly against her chest. The auditorium stared back at her in complete silence. No laughter this time. No disbelief either. Only attention. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. Some minds, he said quietly, do not arrive wrapped in privilege, confidence, or recognition. His voice softened slightly. Sometimes they arrive exhausted from night shifts, carrying borrowed books and years of being underestimated. Naomi felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Across the auditorium, scholars who had spent entire careers chasing prestige now looked toward a young black girl standing quietly in the back row wearing a second-hand coat and a Princeton guest badge. Whitmore returned slowly to the podium. The purpose of mathematics, he said, is not to protect ego. It is to pursue truth, no matter who discovers it first. Then he opened the revised presentation and began teaching the corrected theorem to the world. Nearly an hour later, when the conference finally ended and the audience rose into applause beneath the glowing chandeliers, Naomi remained standing silently near the back aisle with tears threatening softly behind her eyes. Not because she needed validation anymore, but because for the first time in her life, an entire room full of powerful people had looked at her mind before they looked at anything else. And somewhere beneath the fading applause, Professor Richard Whitmore finally understood the difference between authority and wisdom.